Hello everybody and welcome back to another video about psychology for GCSE under Edexcel, which I appreciate might be difficult over the coming weeks because nobody actually knows whether to revise for exams or not, so we'll see how it goes. But here is something to help you out if you are still planning on revising. The specification probably won't change either, so even if you have your GCSEs next year, then this should still help. This is on memory, which is section B of the GCSE. So let's start. So there are some key terms that you will need to know for memory. So you've got input, which is the sensory information, and by sensory information I mean information in one of the five senses. So you've got your touch, you've got your smell, you've got your sight, you've got your hearing, you've got your taste as well, and those all enter memory, and that's what's known as the input. The processing is how it's changed into a form which can be memorized. How it's encoded is so for example, if I was going to say a sentence, I'd say, so for example, the sensory information was processed so that it could be encoded as a auditory memory. So encoding, it means that you actually make it into the form. The processing is the way that the brain does that. The storage is the keeping of memory. The retrieval is the recalling of information. So when you, for example, recall a fact, then when you say a fact, then that's retrieval. Output is what you can actually retrieve, what you can say and remember. Duration is how long a piece of information lasts in memory, and capacity is how much can actually be stored. So we've got the multi-store model here, and this is just a simplification of it. So we will have a look. So sensory memory, so that's this really tiny bit of memory that's just at the start, and it's one of the three stores, and it has a duration of a split second, so a fraction of a second, maybe even a quarter, that's it, and it's trying to create a flow of information, so a constant flow of information. When you look around a room, for example, when you see something and just acknowledge its existence, like just notice it, like for example I have a book next to me, then just acknowledging its existence will put it into sensory memory, or maybe into short-term memory. It's a bit more complicated is what I'm trying to say, but it's about creating a flow of information. That's what sensory memory is for. And it has different registers for each sense. So you've got echoic, which is sound. You've got, I wrote ionic there, it's actually meant to be iconic. It's actually meant to be iconic, so I'll use the pen again, so there should be a C in there, so iconic. You've got gustatory for taste as well, and you've got more as well. Olfactory, I believe, as well, is for smell, I think. So short-term memory, so this bit here, is where your memories go after you've put them through sensory memory. So if you, for example, see something and you pay attention to it, proper attention to it, then it will go into short-term memory and you will remember it for at least 7 seconds. Around, I say at least 7 seconds, at least around about amount of time. So it can last up to 30 seconds anyway. There is some research on this which we'll get into, called Peterson and Peterson. But yes, that's 7. So that's the capacity. That's how many pieces can be stored in it, how many pieces of information. There were different ways of testing this, but usually what they use is strings of digits to test this, which you can debate how useful that is in however you want. Held in auditory formats, so you hear information. So when you look back into your short-term memory, so when you, for example, I have a book next to me and I notice it, if I need to remember something from short-term memory, it will come to me like a voice in my head. and this can really be seen if you're trying to remember a string of digits. So here's a little experiment. If I say to you 2371, then I want you to remember it for a little bit. The fact that you'll probably be repeating in your head like 2371, 2371, and that's what I mean, the inner voice. That's the repeating bit. So that's what we call that's the short-term memory bit. And what you're actually doing when you do that is you're rehearsing it. Long-term memory. So long-term memory, the capacity is 50 years. It can be more. It's definitely at least more in some cases. But that's recorded by Bartlett, who used pictures of former classmates and basically found that people could still recognise some classmates after 50 years. So clearly, it's long. Right, I have got capacity and duration the wrong way around here. Well done, me. You'll notice that this PowerPoint has a lot of errors in it, but it worked for me anyway. So that's not capacity. Right, so capacity, that's duration there, and that's capacity. So it has a potential infinite capacity, and everything is held, it's encoded semantically, so by meaning. So if you, for example, have to walk the dog every day at 8 a.m, the way you might remember that is, I don't know, you might remember it as when I wake up, take the dog for a run, or take the dog out, or take Buddy out, or something like that, something which depends on meaning, not on sound. So that's what semantic means, it means meaning. Okay, so what does this diagram here mean? So basically, when you have sensory memory, which is the one that lasts for about a quarter of a second, then if you forget it, or if you don't pay attention to it, basically, then it just decays. If you pay attention to sensory memory, to something in sensory memory, then it goes into short-term memory, and it can either be decay or it can be displaced. So because there's a limited capacity in short-term memory, if you notice something else, then that might displace another piece of information and just shove it out of the way, basically. So that's what decay is. Then you have to rehearse. Now rehearsal, if you do it enough, it just puts things back in short-term memory, but there is a point where if you rehearse something enough, it goes into long-term memory, and then once it's in long-term memory, it can stay there if you keep rehearsing it a lot of the time, but if not, then it faces either decay, which is where it just dies off because it's not being rehearsed, or it's interfered with. So basically, if it's like it's not like another piece of information coming and replacing it. Instead, interference is more like a piece of information coming along and editing your knowledge somehow. So for example, you might remember an actor's name wrong because you associate them with a character, and then another actor plays that character now, for example. Okay, evaluating the multi-tool model. I know that we haven't actually looked at any studies for it yet, but we will do. So, useful for revision and education. Yeah. So if you want to revise, then it's useful for that. Difficult to prove as a whole, so you can't actually, if you notice, then you've got the three parts. You have to, it's very difficult to prove every single bit of this. You usually have to split it down, which is called reductionism, which we'll get onto later. There is a lack of evidence. No, not a lack of evidence. Lots of evidence. That's good. So we have HM, we have Clive Wearing, we have Peterson Peterson, we have Miller. Miller is the one that showed that there are 7 plus minus 2 chunks. And how Miller did it is he took people, participants, and I believe he just used strings of digits. He started off on 1 digit, and then he went to 2 digits, and then 3 digits, and 4 digits, and 5 digits, and 6 digits, and 7 digits. And basically, the one that you didn't falter at was your capacity. So 7 plus minus 2. That 7 plus minus 2 means it can go from 5 to 9 chunks. So it can either be 5 chunks of information or 9 chunks. Barrick, lab experiments lack ecovalidity. If you were here last time when I was discussing this, ecovalidity literally means it applies to the real world, or it's true in the real world. So if you're doing something in a lab, what's the chance that it's actually going to be true, or any of the findings you get are going to be true in the real world? Oversimplified, no differentiation between factual, periodical and procedural memory. Right. So these two are things that I have to correct. So procedural memory is what it's called. Factual is called semantic memory. And I'm doing a terrible job of this handwriting thing. Periodical is called, so we've got semantic, we have procedural, and what's the autobiographical one called? Let me just check for you actually. This is it. Autobiograph. Episodic. That's it, episodic. So we've got semantic, we've got episodic, and we've got procedural. So semantic is facts, so semantic is hard facts, like a book has pages in it or something. Periodical, as I've called it, it's actually episodic, is about what you've done in your life. So for example, yesterday I fed the cat. Procedural is actually about how you do things, so for example, how you write your name. I think we'll get on to H.M. Waring and Peterson in a bit, but that's to do with semantic, episodic and procedural. I'll just check if we do. Yes, we do. Next slide. Right. Brilliant. So, H.M. Henry Molaison cracked his skull and had regular seizures. His hippocampus was removed so that the seizures would go away, but he couldn't form new memories. He could remember a number, though, for 15 minutes, but then he would forget the test had taken place. And he could remember past a decade beforehand as well, and it shows that long-term memory and short-term memory are separate. It also shows that short-term memory and long-term memory are separate because he could form a short-term memory, so he could remember a number for 15 minutes if he kept repeating it to himself, which must have been really boring. And long-term memory is just like, he couldn't create new long-term memories. He couldn't make new memories that would go into the long term that would last him through the rest of his life. There's another thing about this though. Right, when H.M. Injured himself, he had to use a walking frame, like a Zimmer frame sort of thing. And he had used one of these before. Now, if he can't form long-term memories, the researchers would have thought he would have to learn how to use the walking frame every single time he used it. But he didn't. He just, hopped on and did it. He knew how to do it. He was able to use it and learnt it. And he didn't have to learn how to use it every time he used it. He just could use it. Like, as soon as he picked it up once, he could pick it up again and just go with it. So that's what we mean by procedural memory. So, procedural memory. That's what we mean. We mean HM being able to pick up the walking frame and go with it, and walk with it instead of just having to, whatever. Instead of just having to learn again and again, Right. Clive Wearing, so he had something called viral encephalitis, and he got anterograde and retrograde amnesia. Now, anterograde is about not being able to form new long-term memories after the event, and retrograde is about not being able to remember before the event. So you have a car crash, then, retrograde would refer to before the car crash, anterograde after the car crash. So Clive Wearing had both of these, and in fact he had it really terribly because his brain matter was actually starting to decay, to the point that he couldn't actually form short-term memories either. Well, not that. He couldn't form short-term memories. But the thing is that he could still play a piano, for example. He could still, lead an orchestra if he wanted, because he had musical training at one point, but he never remembered having musical training. He didn't remember that episodic memory. He did know, however, how to play a piano. Now, there's a really sort of, I want to call it chilling, documentary about Clive Wearing, where you sort of see that because he literally, his brain can't, handle the fact that he's in the same place every single time or something has happened, then he will have these moments where he just shakes all over because his brain just has to try and keep up, if you see what I mean, but he can't form short-term memories. That's the thing. Anyway, another side note of this is that he remembers people. He does actually remember people. So, for example, he knows who his wife is somehow, but he will never remember when he visited her or when if she leaves the room, his care room, then he will just forget she was there, and when she returns back in, she will just sort of, it'll feel like he's never seen her for ages. He writes in his diary that he's tasted coffee for the first time, or he's woken up for the first time, because he doesn't remember anything before the exact moment. And it's really quite eerie, I want to say. I know that sounds kind of offensive, but it is really quite awful to think that could happen to someone. But it is very fascinating at the same time. This is one of your key studies as well, Peterson and Peterson, this one here. So a key study, if you remember from last time, is something that you have to learn to be able to answer questions in the exam. You will be specifically asked about it. So Peterson and Peterson, 1959. So actually, Peterson and Peterson are married. They're a married couple, so kind of sweet. They do it together. They did it together. So it's a lab experiment, so it's performed in a lab. So an experiment in controlled conditions where an independent variable is manipulated for a dependent variable. Right, now I'm going to be really honest here. I don't think that science teachers cover the whole independent variable, dependent variable difference enough, and I only really got it when I went into psychology. So an independent variable is the one that you change. So, for example, if I wanted to do a quick experiment to see how people react when they have their fingers dipped in boiling water or water of different temperatures, then the independent variable would be the temperature of the water, because that's the thing the experimenter changes, and the dependent variable is the product of that. The dependent variable would be like whether people scream or not when they have their fingers dipped in the boiling water or whatever. So they both have to be measured, but in a lab experiment it's about controlling all of the conditions so that an independent variable can be manipulated to measure a dependent variable. You'll understand it when I go through it more for Peterson and Peterson. So the aim was to understand the duration of short-term memory with distractions. So duration, you remember how long it lasts. Short-term memory is the one in the middle of the diagram. We know that it lasts about 30 seconds, but we'll, So the procedure. 24 students from an intro, there should be an R there, to psychology course. Each participant was given set instructions. They would be given a trigram, so that's 3 letters like CVG or A, U, I or something to remember, and there was also a black box. When the black box gave a green light, participants would have to count back from a 3-digit number and try to remember the trigram when the red light came on. So they would have to count back in threes from a 3-digit number, so we can do this now actually. So for example, if I say UPQ, then count down now from 342 in threes. Okay, what was the trigram? Well done, if you got it, it was UPQ. That's how they did it. There's a lot of threes to remember, but also they did the timing in threes. So actually they gave the participants 3 seconds to count down, then 6 seconds to count down, then 9 seconds, then 12 seconds, then 15 seconds, all with different trigrams, of course, and they tested how many participants got the trigram right. So by 18 seconds, most of the participants had forgotten the trigram. There was a 50% recallability at 3 seconds and a 10% recallability at 15 seconds. And the conclusion was that information decays rapidly from short-term memory. So by about 18 seconds, I think what you could get away with saying is that it was by 30 seconds that everyone had definitely forgotten the trigram. So you can probably say that short-term memory lasts at most 30 seconds if you really want to. Although it's disputed, so you could say in an exam, at most, according to Peterson and Peterson, it lasts 30 seconds, or for most people, it lasts 18 seconds, according to Peterson and Peterson. Okay, here's our evaluation. If you remember from last time what each of these bits means, then that helps us out, but I will go through it. So, reliable means if you did the same thing next time, would you get the same results? And that depends on things like, is there a standardized procedure, which is all participants going through the same conditions? We will get to experimental design in a bit, but for now I'm just going to leave that a minute. What else? The number of participants affects it, so there's 24 participants in this study, which means its reliability is meh on that. All participants go through same conditions. That's a not repeated measure. That's not repeated measures design though. That should be a plus or a comma. Repeated measures design. All participants go through all conditions. That is what repeated measures design is. Right, okay, so no. Standardized procedure is when all participants, or the participants who need to, have the same conditions, and there's less extraneous variables, there's less variables that the researcher isn't controlling. So we've got not repeated measures, standardized procedure, and we've got 24 participants as well. Right, objective. So how objective is it? So how up for discussion are the results? So basically, either you remember the trigram or you don't. So it's very objective. So there's no, maybe he did remember the trigram. It's definitely you did or you didn't. So that's objective. It's not down to discussion. Right, valid. So validity is how true it is. So demand characteristics are possible. So it's possible that a person acted the way that they wanted that they thought the researcher wanted them to act. So for example, if you go into the study and you think, the researcher wants this, I shall do that, then that's demand characteristics. And it's more possible in lab studies because you're really interacting with the fact that it is a study. Not ecologically valid either, it might not be true in the real world. Generalizable, so that's how much does it apply to your target population. Presumably Peterson and Peterson's target population was the whole human race. So is it generalizable to the whole human race? Well, they were all students from the United States, so there's a limited age range, limited geography, so low generalizability. Useful applications, education, so that's where you could apply it usefully. Ethical, they got full consent and there's no real risk of harm at all. Okay, experimental design. So this is where we're going to have a foray into experimental design. I know that some teachers and some people who teach psychology like to actually deal with all of these bits and bobs in the last bit. and sort of deal with experimental design in the research methods part of the course, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this. So independent groups design is when you have different groups doing different conditions. So in a study you will have different conditions. So these are basically, a condition is a change in the independent variable. So for example, in Peterson Peterson you had the condition of 3 seconds timing, 6 seconds timing, 9 seconds timing, 12 seconds timing, 15 seconds timing, and so on. That's what a condition is. Different groups doing different conditions. So say if they'd split down the groups in Peterson Peterson and had one group doing 3 seconds, one group doing 6 seconds, one group doing 9 seconds, etc., 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 and the groups don't mix, they're just one group for each of those, then that would be independent groups. Repeated measure is when all of the people do all of the conditions, which is what Peterson and Peterson did. So they do all of the bits of the independent variable. So matched pairs is where you have, it's the same as independent groups, but you have similar attributes on all of the sides of the independent variable. So it would be like if Peterson Peterson said, well, we want one man and one woman in each of the timings, so one man and one woman in 3 seconds, one man, one woman in 6 seconds, blah, blah, blah. It's just trying to match all of the attributes of a person. Order effects is how the order a condition can be performed in can affect results. So if we go back to the Peterson Peterson example, if someone did it in 3 seconds, then 6 seconds, then 9 seconds, they might get bored. So you might want to mix it around a bit. Counterbalancing, so that would mean that if you had 2 conditions, then half of the participants would do condition A, then condition B, and the other group would do condition B, then condition A. And randomization is when you just have a bunch of conditions, so you just do it in a random order. So repeated measures might actually make a study more reliable because it means that you actually have more people doing everything. So more people doing the whole shebang, basically. Evaluating lab experiments. So this is something you might have to come on to as well. No, do we literally not? Oh, yes, we did. Right, okay. So cause and effect. So internal validity is where you have cause and effect. So for example, if I spill coffee on my lap, I'm going to burn myself. That's kind of what cause and effect is. It means if you do X, then you'll get Y. In a lab experiment, because you're changing an independent variable to get a dependent variable, then you can show that. Just as Peterson Peterson showed that the more time that you have someone distracted for, the less they are going to remember a trigram. So that's what internal validity is. It shows that one thing can happen and it has a definite effect. There's reduced ecological validity because, you're in a lab, it's not the outside world. Conditions can be repeated on many people, so you can do it on loads and loads of people, and case studies you can't do that because you've got a limited sample of those involved in the case study. And also it's generally ethical because in a lab experiment you have so many participants that you can preserve confidentiality, so you can preserve their anonymity. Right, theory of reconstructive memory. So schema is a set of pre-existing knowledge about a piece of information built through experience. Right, so this is the main thing you need to know for TORM. I like to call it TORM, so that's what we'll call it, and that's what most people actually call it now. So TORM. Right, a good way to describe a schema is a pocket of knowledge or a simplified mental representation. Now, how do I remember simplified mental representation? Because I remember ASMR and then I just knock the A off. So I have SMR, simplified mental representation. It's a set of pre-existing knowledge about a piece of information, and it's built through experience. Schemas guide interactions and memories, and they fill in the gaps or reconstruct a memory when we don't actually have that piece of information or we can't recall it. So, we do have a case study. Good. No, then we just, right, okay. Wow, okay, so you can, so these are just, sort of Cliff's Notes sort of thing. So Loftus and Palmer, this is, supporting theory of reconstructive memory. So people were shown a video of a car crash, and they were given a leading question. Now this asked them how fast was the car going, and and I think they had to write it in a specific number, and it asked for how fast were the cars going when they crashed, when they hit, when they touched, and they changed the verb. So that's the doing word, the verb, and that's what a leading question is. It leads you onto a certain answer, and people actually changed their answer. So that shows that the theory of reconstructive memory is true, because a leading question would presumably change your schema. It would change the way you think about it. So it would change your simplified mental representation of it. So exactly. Bartlett, we'll get on to Bartlett in a minute. It's called War of the Ghosts, and it's really weird and hard to explain, but we'll get on to it. Ewell and Cutshaw was a field experiment. 13 homicide witnesses resisted leading questions. So these were people who'd actually resisted a homicide and witnessed a homicide, and they resisted leading questions, so resisted questions which led them on to a certain answer, and they gave what they knew. So that kind of disproves TORM, because it shows that schemas can not be affected in certain cases. Bartlett, when we get onto Bartlett, it's artificial, and then we should have talked earlier as well in multi-store memory that it doesn't distinguish as well between the factual, so the semantic, versus the procedural versus the episodic. So factual, semantic, procedural is how to do things, and episodic is autobiographical, so what happened in your life. LTM versus STM, so short-term memory and long-term memory. TORM doesn't have that distinction, and it's useful in eyewitness testimonies, because if you think about it, if someone's answer can be changed by their simplified mental representations, then our eyewitness testimony is going to be okay in court. Probably not. So, War of the Ghosts. This is Bartlett's study. Now this, your teacher might have tried to do something about repeated reproduction, or repeated reproduction, or I don't know, that. They might have explained it in a convoluted way. If I'm going to be really honest, it was explained in a convoluted way to me, so this hopefully should help. So, the aim was to understand how memory of a story links to previous knowledge and culture. So, a schema is built on knowledge and culture, previous knowledge and culture. The procedure, there were 20 who were Brits. They all heard a Native American story. That's where the cultural aspect comes in. And they use repeated reproduction. So they heard a story and they reproduced it over months and years, and they kept telling it. So War of the Ghosts was the name of the story. You can look it up if you want. It's a Native American story, and people recalled it after 15 minutes, and then 10, and then 20 years. The results, so people generally preserve the order of the event, but they change the material in it. So, for example, hunting seals became fishing, and canoe became boat. So schemas due to culture caused these changes in what Bartlett thought, Evaluating Bartlett. So we've got the reliable, so the story can be reused, but the time gaps are inconsistent. So that time gap's inconsistent means that if you maybe did the study a tiny bit differently, you might get different results. So that means it's less reliable. So the story can be reused, that means it's kind of reliable. Objective, so debate over what the changes mean. It's very subjective as to whether hunting seals becoming fishing actually means that it's due to culture. And the data's qualitative, which means it's not numbers, it's words and descriptions, so it's going to be more subjective. Research bias is always possible, so that could affect how true it is. Validity, so Bartlett's own biases about his views could affect how he interprets it. Low eco-validity, so low ecological validity, so the participants needed to actually recall the story word for word, or Bartlett would be like, aha, that's because of culture. So actually that isn't how memory actually works in the real world. It isn't really how we deal with stories either. We don't recall stories word for word. Like, we don't recall Cinderella word for word, do we? We just have a vague idea, and that's how we recall it. So is it fair to expect people to, recall things like that? I mean, we already know from the multi-store model that things are stored semantically, so that could be what is going on. Seal hunting and fishing have kind of similar meanings, so that could be what's going on, the semantic thing. Generalizable, all the same culture. So, you could have had if you want to prove TORM for everyone the world over, you could have taken a Russian sample as well, and some Swedes and some Indians and some people from China or Japan, for example, just to sort of say, we've got we're representing people, and it still wouldn't affect the element of it. Ethical, no harm that I can see of. So amnesia, so retrograde amnesia is you can't remember long-term memories before accident, and anterograde is you cannot form new long-term memories after the accident. Okay, so you might be asked how these are treated. So generally for retrograde you can say things like, you can put post-it notes out, or a person in care might, they might have to be reminded of things or told things that they've done before the accident. So for example, if you this is the first example that came into my head. If you started selling your house before you had like a car accident, you'd need to be consistently reminded of it by your partner, wouldn't you? And these are the sort of things that you'd need at least a helping hand, like post-it notes on things, and your partner being able to be there whenever you need to remember something, which is quite often. Anterograde is you can't form new long-term memories after the accident. Again, post-it notes possibly. So if you can't form new long-term memories, then, if you fed the cat at like 4 a.m, you might not remember you fed them at about 12. So you might need a post-it note for that, or something along those lines, or a calendar to write these things on so that you remember, or at least that you know. Reductionism and holism. Right. Reductionism and holism are very interesting in themselves, and they all have their own nuances, and this is an interesting part of psychology. A good way to demonstrate the difference between the two is look at a vacuum cleaner. Do you understand a vacuum cleaner by breaking down a vacuum cleaner, understanding every single little nut, bolt and cog, or do you understand a vacuum cleaner by watching it in action, sort of thing? Holism is that watching it in action, it's understanding the links between the parts to understand the whole, and reductionism is breaking down something to understand its parts. Holism says things like the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and reductionism disagrees. Holism would say I can only understand a vacuum cleaner by watching it in action and trying to understand how, say, the cog there interacts with the handle, or meanwhile reductionism says we can take it apart and understand how every little bit works, and then we can understand a vacuum cleaner. Reductionism, that's a multi-store model, because loads of studies break it down and understand the different little parts. Peterson Peterson is also reductionist because it only studies the short-term memory. Loftus and Palmer is also reductionist because it only studied schemas, one aspect of schemas. Holism is most case studies because it takes into account everything about a person or their past or their knowledge or their injury. The thing about that I do want to point out about holism that and reductionism that you'll notice with the multi-store model, this is really good criticism, is that because it's reductionist, it kind of forgets how the parts specifically link together. So there's trying to research, for example, how short-term memory moves into long-term memory. We know that rehearsal causes it, but how much rehearsal, what type of rehearsal, these things need to be elaborated on. And there are lots of models now in psychology which do kind of try to do that, and they're like massive sort of coding-y, computery sort of things that try to map out the brain as if it was a computer. Anyway, pros of reductionism. So holism can be really subjective, so it's trying to determine how two parts are linked together, and that might not necessarily always be objective, it might be down to your perception. And it allows each part to be reductionism allows every part to be tested and understood minutely separately. Pros of holism is you understand the bigger picture generally, and you keep ecological validity, because if you think about it, when a hoover is out in the wild, on the landing, on the carpet, it isn't just a collection of cogs, is it? It's something that processes your dirt. So holism, understanding how that whole vacuum cleaner interacts, will be ecologically valid, and it'll be true to, you know, how a vacuum cleaner acts in the real world. Oh yes, field experiments. Field experiments? Field experiments. So this is the last bit on memory that we're going to go through. So field experiments, ecologically valid, so they're true. So a field experiment, if we go back to TORM, so we've got Loftus and Palmer. No, wrong one. Yull and Kutschel. Right, a field experiment is where you take the idea of an experiment, so changing an independent variable and finding a dependent variable, but we're using a real life situation out in the wild, basically, so outside of a lab. So that applies to Yull and Kutschel because 13 homicide witnesses, it's taking the homicide and it's sort of asking questions, and that's what makes it a field experiment, because it's out in the wild. So it's ecologically valid because it's out in the real world, it's going to be true to the real world. Demand characteristics are reduced because people might not necessarily feel as if they're in a study, so because they're not in a lab, so that's going to reduce demand characteristics. It also reduces internal validity because there's a lot of extraneous variables that could come in, and that would reduce the ability to show cause and effect. So, you know, if someone I don't know, trips over or stubs their toe outside, and then a branch falls on their head, and a really harsh gust of icy wind comes along, and they just say ow, you don't know which one they're saying ow at, so you can't demonstrate cause and effect. So that's what I mean by reduces internal validity. So it can happen in field experiments because you're doing it outside of the lab, you can't eliminate these extraneous variables. Low ethics, so you might not know you're in a study if you're in a field experiment sometimes, and the extraneous variables I've already mentioned. So low ethics, yeah, so you might not know you're in a study, and also, for example, if it's something rare like homicide, then your anonymity, your confidentiality might not be preserved that well. Okay, so the next topic I'm going to come on to is developmental psychology, but that'll be... Okay, so second part of this is looking at a past paper. Well, this isn't a past paper, because Edexcel is too stubborn to put on a past paper. OCR was nice enough, thanks a lot. Okay, so memory. How does your memory work? Ooh, section B. This is technically called cognitive psychology, by the way, but I mean, you know. Describe the encoding stage of memory. Oh, fig. Right, okay. So the encoding stage technically is the bit between sensory memory and short-term memory, by the way. That's all it is. That's what they mean when they say the encoding stage. It's when they take information from the sensory register and turn it into auditory information for the short-term memory. Describe the difference between anterograde and retrograde. We've just done that. Anterograde is after the event, retrograde is before the event. Paul struggles to remember things due to a recent accident. Parole. Explain how Parole could try and remember new events. You should refer to the multi-store model in your answer. Okay, so basically you've got to mention rehearsal. That's all it is. So the way things move into long-term memory is rehearsal. So you could suggest that if Parole encounters a new event, once it enters short-term memory, he should try and keep rehearsing it, which could include testing himself until it enters long-term memory. And this might include the help of others. Ajay in his psychology class, when a female intruder enters, she threatens the teacher and takes a mobile phone. The intruder was male and carrying a knife. Ajay's memory may be inaccurate. You should refer to a theory. So you could say the theory of reconstructive memory states that Ajay's schema, brackets simplified mental representation of the event of robbers or intruders, would be a male carrying a knife, and when Ajay forgets what the intruder looks like, the schema would reconstruct the false memory and make the intruder male and make him carry a knife instead of being female. Emma has created a study to test the accuracy of memory. So we have, this is another stats question. So Ten friends read a story. Participant 1. Participant 10 was asked to write down what happened in the story. So this is at the end. So participant 10, 227, 500, 1 paragraph, 3 paragraphs. So actually, accuracy of content 68%. So what you could conclude is that information naturally decays if not rehearsed, for example, and you could use that by talking about the accuracy of content or the number of words, for example. 2 weaknesses, you could say that actually, because it involves multiple participants dependent on each other, it isn't actually about the accuracy of a individual person's memory, and it doesn't actually get 10 results, it only gets 1 result. So that could be your first weakness, that it actually, because the participants are dependent on each other, it can't actually accurately and validly test each participant, and weakness 2 is that you've only got 1 result. And then explain 1 improvement. You could the improvement you'd have to make would be literally either splitting it down. So if you said, if Emma wants to use the procedure, then Emma could either gather more participants and split them into smaller groups, so that she could gather more results and more reproductions to compare. Oh, that's it. 16 marks right there. Right, okay. So these were all 2 markers. All 2 markers. Sometimes you might get it like that. I think there's a 9 marker as well on this. If it will load. Do you want to load? Hopefully it loads in a minute. Right, there we are. Okay, so I think this is, section A. So we're going to go and see if the 9 marker is about Hashim, depression. I'm pretty sure Jagdeep is in a local shopping centre, and her mum has just called to say she needs to come home quickly. Jagdeep sees a woman fall over in the centre of the walkway. Once Jagdeep arrives home, she tells her mum that she helped the woman. Right, okay. So you could use memory in this, or you could use social psychology. Yeah, I think they expect you to use memory and social psychology. Let's have a look at the little mark scheme. See what they think. Okay, so come on. Right. So, attention in rehearsal is required for events to be taken from short-term memory to long-term memory. And then may have not rehearsed the events fully, so it's social psychology and it's also cognitive or memory, so yeah. Okay, so that's going through a few exam questions and going through as well the PowerPoint and just looking at what has to be done to understand psychology for GCSE. Okay,